it is very important to be explicit about the strategic logic of buying time. There's a tendency to be looking for sort of silver bullet solutions or checkmate solutions that sort of solve this problem. It's probably more credible to imagine steps to control the proliferation of hardware or model weights as through the logic of buying time. Buying time for us to establish more robust measures to both govern the technology, but also to prepare our societies for this transition. It's difficult for me to imagine, us limiting the development of widely proliferated advanced AI for 100 years. So then when one proposes any one of these specific countermeasures, like controlling the diffusion of GPUs, one immediately is in the mode of thinking about how much time it buys you.
As artificial general intelligence gets closer, do all signs point to tension or conflict between the U.S. and China? Maybe not necessarily. Our guest this week shows that maybe some of the dynamics of that race and that growing set of AGI powers will bring about coordination in addition to competition. Our guest this week is none other than Joel Predd. He's a director of the Geopolitics for Artificial General Intelligence Initiative at the RAND Corporation. So we've had some public sector people. We're bringing in some other perspectives. And Joel is our fourth episode in the U.S.-China AGI Relations series here on the Trajectory podcast. Joel brings up some of the forces and factors that indeed may cause tension that we should be wary about in terms of the creation of new weapons and things along those lines, but also some of the shared risks or shared opportunities that could be ways to forge new alliances, to create excuses for coordination that might reduce risks and hopefully share in more positive benefits. I will have a lot to say at the outro of this episode, but that's a good enough tee up to start. It's a unique episode in this series, and I hope you'll enjoy it. This is Joel Predd here in the Trajectory. So Joel, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan. It's really great to meet you and have a chance to speak with you.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be able to dive in. There is not nearly enough attention about artificial general intelligence as a distinct thing in the public sector, defense world, et cetera. And you folks have a pretty robust report on, I think, some of the stuff that matters. So we'll open it up kind of broad, and I'll let you take this where you want to take this. As you're explaining to leadership, public sector folks, I guess, primarily, obviously RAND is pretty well trusted for that. When you explain the dynamic between the U.S. and China when it comes to artificial general intelligence, how do you set the stage? What do leaders need to understand as fundamentals here, Joel?
It's a great question. And I think I often say that the easiest way to kill a conversation about AGI is to ask for a definition. But it may be useful to have one. We prefer a simple one, which is that you have human level and potentially superhuman level cognition across a wide range of tasks, perhaps all economically or militarily relevant tasks. Given that definition, there's a few points that I think it's important for policymakers to grasp. First is that they should take the potential for that kind of capability as technically credible, even if its parameters, its timelines, the paradigm it emerges within, and its implications as deeply uncertain. So technically credible, but deeply uncertain. Second, I think they need to know that if it arrives, it would be utterly transformational, presenting both incredible opportunities, but unprecedented risks. And in thinking about those, it's important to guard against incoherence. I think there's a tendency to fall in a trap of thinking about AGI under those definitions as just another technology.
Yeah.
In which it's sort of the future looks like 2010 with AGI characteristics. But in fact, if AGI under those definitions were to emerge, it would be, in some respects, more like a different species than just another better app on your phone. The third point I want to leave folks with is that, unfortunately, there's not a plan. So if you imagine that there is one somewhere, that humanity will have figured this out, that there isn't one. And unfortunately, the pace of progress, fourthly, is outstripping our capacity for governance. So there's a lot of directions we can go from that, but those are, I think, three or four things that I would want to start with.
I really like opening with it. This is a really nice and measured way to introduce the topic. I mean, some of our audience, people who are tuned in here, are somewhat by definition already kind of down to clown when it comes to the potential for post-human intelligence. You gave us a very, I think, let's call it a palatable definition of AGI, right? Like, it could do the productive work. I mean, of course, as you and I could imagine, if you have, a data center of geniuses, if we use Dario language, we would all of a sudden be doing things that might be as like when if your cat is watching us have this call right now, it would be like at that level we might have. But yeah, so you have this nice palatable definition, and I like the way you're framing it. It's like, hey, some of it's deeply uncertain, but if it occurred, there is no plan for what we're going to do with it, and it would be wildly transformative to the degree to which, humans and chimpanzees interact in a certain way. Like there might be some of that kind of going on. I have found, and I certainly have preferences here, I have found that in the abstract is hard for people to grasp, and that often concrete examples of what could something that could do all the productive work change when it comes to communication or education or finance or whatever else, that people need to sort of be able to imagine it. Have there been examples of why you would say species level? I, of course, agree with you here, Joel. But have there been ways of when you communicate species level, ways that you've been able to say that you've found to be palatable to leaders who are otherwise maybe not familiar with these topics?
My experience with this is that everyone has their own sort of journey on this. It's one of those that you just kind of have to sit with it for a while. And I have found that it's been really interesting to sit and observe this from within the RAND Corporation. And watch many of my colleagues who started thinking about this seriously a little over 18 months ago, and watch us all sort of follow our own journeys from pretty skeptical to we got to take this pretty seriously. Yeah. And I think if you ask all those people that I've seen, who, I want to be clear, we all disagree about many things in this space in terms of its implications and timelines and what should we do about it, what should our strategy be. There's lots of room for disagreement. But everyone has a slightly different story about why they became convinced that this is important. Huh. And so I think
interesting.
One of the things I resist in talking to policymakers and others is I can give you my argument. You kind of got to sit with it on your own.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So from your experience, different people got hit in different ways. I had Yasho Bengio was the first episode here on The Trajectory. Yeah. He kind of talked about how ChatGPT kind of flipped him from maybe this is just a tool we fiddle-faddle with into maybe agency and outstripping human capability would be possible. You had your own journey. Other RAND people have had their own journey. If I'm quite frank with you, I think that some of this is like a psychological cognitive dissonance. The pieces have to get put back together in your mind kind of a thing. Yeah. So at some point, so Confucius has this phrase, every man has two lives. The second one starts when he realizes he only has one. I think that that's very true, and that people tend to lift their goals from kind of individualistic to potentially, humanistic, anthropocentric when they sort of realize they may not be here forever, or they're almost certainly not going to be here forever. I think there's a species level version of that, which I think is actually extremely hard for people to digest, which comes after the realization of just pure risk. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of psychological chewing. And in this dynamic where we find ourselves between the US and China, there's components of potentially dominance and competition. There's also maybe some openings for coordination around this really challenging problem for humanity. Certainly no one in China or the US, hopefully, at least not smart people, would hope that this leads to some grand optimizer just consuming biolife. When you think about the US and China being in this predicament you've just laid on the table that has no answers, what do people need to know about US and China and the dynamics between them that are cooperative and competitive?
That's a great question. So as you know, my colleague Jim Mitri and I wrote this paper, The 5 Hard National Security Problems from AGI, and that very much constrains our thinking on this, or shapes our thinking on this. And it's done in collaboration with a multidisciplinary and interesting team here at RAND. One of the interesting things about those 5 problems, and if I may, I'll give you a short summary of them, is that they present different opportunities for the U.S.-China relationship, but also different modes of competition. So very briefly, the first problem that we see is the possibility that an artificial general intelligence could create could empower non-experts to create WMDs in a way that they weren't previously able. So we have precedent for that. For example, with other non-state actors using WMDs or threatening to use WMDs, but we're imagining that AGI in this case would act as a sort of malicious mentor. Interestingly, this is a problem that, at least in principle, whether or not in practice, could be an area of collaboration between the US and China. Neither of us have interest in sort of AGI-enabled terrorists.
Yeah.
A second problem, though, that we see is the prospect of an AGI wonder weapon, in which AGI in the hands of a state actor acts as a sort of innovation agent that creates weapons that are difficult for us to imagine right now, whether that be a bioweapon, a cyber weapon, or some innovation in physics or chemistry that creates new material science that changes ballistic missile defenses or what have you. It more or less changes the military balance overnight, if not literally in very short order, not unlike the splitting of the atom. This problem is one in which the US and China may have some incentives to avoid, but we're very much in a competition there. The third problem is one that's more systemic, but it's a shift in the basis of power, economically, scientifically, militarily. It doesn't happen overnight, but it also doesn't happen on intergenerational timescales. And it may be because it's not because whether the US or China is first to cross some technology threshold, but we're first to use it in some way in which one of us prospers, grows more secure, and the other one languishes. And this is another one where we're in fierce competition. The fourth problem, though, is one in which, again, where our interests would seem to align, in which an AGI emerges with enough independence and autonomy to act in some measure as an agent on the global stage in its own right. Now, this is often associated with loss of control and rogue AI and misalignment. Some of that terminology comes with baggage, but you don't necessarily have to go to the most science fiction forms of those scenarios in order for them to cause concern. But it would seem that the US and China have aligned interests to avoid many of those scenarios. And the fourth one, where it does seem like there's aligned interest as well, is instability on the path to some of these futures, in which the US or China act out in various ways, potentially up to and including preventive wars, either to preserve or prevent others' progress in view of these other high-stakes issues. So when we think about the competition, there's elements of these problems that are both fiercely competitive, but also opportunities that may be created for us to find some way to transition humanity to an AGI future safely, securely, prosperously.
Yeah, this is great. If you don't mind here, Joel, I'd love to kind of pick into a few of these that you've laid on the table. And I really like the framing you're bringing to this. And everybody's had a different frame. Kukor, Shanahan, there's different things to emphasize. You're sort of laying out a big dynamic international scenario where, due to some of these unprecedented new possibilities that may emerge, and dangers, frankly, that may emerge, there are maybe things that would poke and prod and spurn us in the direction of coordinating to maybe solve for them, and maybe others that would poke and prod us in the direction of sort of competing and kind of racing to be the victor. So I'll get into a few of these. You had brought up the idea of non-state actors. We've had other guests in this series that kind of mentioned the idea that it's possible that a place where coordination might occur would be the prevention of kind of hardware's proliferation, maybe like to those knick-knack individual players wherever they are. Anybody who would like to use AGI to design bioweapons or whatever the case may be. So maybe, China has pretty limited hardware that they can sell to the rest of the world. The US has, of course, NVIDIA and a bunch of other players. Maybe because the US has even more that they would kind of be giving up by doing this, some degree of kind of binding coordination of, hey, let's make sure this stuff is not available outside of these ranges? Maybe that could be a first place to kind of get together. Like, yeah, we're kind of racing against each other, but also we don't want everybody with $1 billion to be able to potentially threaten our citizenry or the global order altogether. How do you see this? When you see this as a potential for coordination, what would be the juncture? What might be the means? I mean, I'm not asking you to lay out a full plan, but like, what comes to your mind?
So I have a few thoughts on that. First, in terms of the specific technical measures to control the proliferation of models or compute, I would defer to some of my colleagues like Leonard, Haim, and others at RAND that have thought more deeply about that than I would. But I would have a few thoughts for you at a higher level. The first is, I think that it is very important to be explicit about the strategic logic of buying time. I think there's a tendency to view, in my view, I don't know that everyone is equally vulnerable to this critique, but there's a tendency to be looking for sort of silver bullet solutions or checkmate solutions that sort of solve this problem. And my view is that it's probably more credible to imagine steps to control the proliferation of hardware or model weights as through the logic of buying time for us to establish more robust measures to both govern the technology, but also to prepare our societies for this transition. So I think that's an important context here because it's difficult for me to imagine, us limiting the development of widely proliferated advanced AI for 100 years.
Oh, absolutely.
So then when one proposes any one of these specific countermeasures, like controlling the diffusion of GPUs, one immediately is in the mode of thinking about how much time it buys you. And what are you going to do with that time you're bought? So that's one.
It's a great framing. It's a good mental frame. It's not a silver bullet. It is a time buyer. And we're going to talk about what to do with buying that time. So, okay, I like that. What else is important for you to list here?
The other point is that when you think about the no kidding technical measures or governance measures or diplomatic measures that would be needed to govern this, many of them feel utterly implausible.
I agree with you. But specifically, what are the ones that are posited that you see as implausible and why?
Well, just at a very basic level, I think the level of trust in the U.S.-China relationship is extremely low. So the
not
idea
in a great
of
place.
Kind of grand bargain on AI governance, given the stakes that it has for security and economic competition, seems implausible. But the thing that I think is important is that there may come a moment when there's a window of opportunity to do something like that. Whether it's necessarily a moment in the U.S.-China relationship, but just a moment domestically to enact different domestic policies or seize opportunities in AI diffusion, whatever it may be, there may be a window of opportunity that is created by events. And so we should be prepared to seize them when they happen.
No, it absolutely does. We're going to get to how do we even think about this ending up okay? Because in my opinion, you carry the logic far enough on some of this stuff, and it's like, all right. But we got to do our best here. I'm going to chunk through some of the other points before I get into those bigger questions. You talked about, the idea of this technology potentially being able to, create some fundamental shift in terms of like science or what have you. Frankly, Joel, I'm shocked we have not discovered something akin to splitting the atom since we did it. Isn't it strange? I mean, the last 100 years have been a profound period of progress across many different strata of technology and, a lot of population growth, including in the developed countries. The fact that we haven't discovered anything like that is maybe even almost fortunate. But it seems like if you have wildly powerful general intelligence systems capable of not only reading all the scientific papers, which for me isn't even that interesting. I mean, it's profound, but it's not that interesting compared to these systems will at some point be physically handling the life sciences experiments. They'll be physically handling the material science experiments. They'll be physically like boots on the ground, tactile senses, all being piped into a central system. When these things are touching the world, with vastly more senses than the goofy 5 that we walk around with, and they can read everything in science in every conceivable language. Is there not one more atom split that we could conceive of? Something as paradigmatically important as that in biology, in physics, in what have you? I mean, it seems quite likely that would be the case. You see this as an area where maybe the US and China will want to kind of keep those really cool things to themselves because the amount of prosperity or power they may wield by discovering them would be inordinate, and they would want to make sure they have them for themselves. Is that a proper framing, or did I nutshell incorrectly? I want to make sure I understand what you mean.
Well, I am definitely not in the forecasting business. I think there are others who are better at that than I am. So I think the prospect that a general artificial intelligence could, quote unquote, to use your words, split an atom, or maybe it was my words, so to speak, metaphorically, to innovate some new, fundamentally disruptive military capability, I think that needs to be treated as technically credible, even if it's deeply uncertain. And I think the questions are multiple on that. One of them is that what might that weapon look like? And to whatever degree
forecast,
of situational awareness one could have in anticipating that would be very, very useful. But also, how do we maintain stability in our relationship? How do we maintain deterrence, maybe mutual deterrence in that relationship, in the face of profound uncertainty is of critical importance.
Yeah. And so the idea of rogue AI came up, and you had said some of that carries baggage. I wonder if sometimes the baggage isn't like, we have to speak in really trepidatious terms because otherwise people's brains turn off. So we have to like introduce things in like really banal ways. But like whatever we want to call it, loss of control, whatever. There are very, very, very technically adept folks that are working on the screaming edge of this stuff or the godfathers of this science who very much see loss of control as a tremendously real, credible, like as you had said, technically credible risk, uncertain in terms of time horizons or whatever, but incredibly real actual risk here. What do you foresee that? So here's what I would imagine would happen if you're in the room with folks that are whatever, diplomats, DOD people, whatever, who never really thought about this. And you're like, yeah, well, loss of control is an issue. They'd be like, what? How do you even explain loss of control to people, Joel?
I have a few reactions to that. One of the things that we're doing at RAND is thinking through what one might call non-existential loss of control events, ones that don't necessarily require you to go to the most outlandish, what some would perceive as outlandish. It is very easy to imagine scenarios in which we begin to integrate advanced AI systems into our energy grid, and it's showing productive improvements in load balancing and gaining efficiencies that are incredibly productive and useful. And then those agents have enough autonomy and independence to just act haywire in those critical infrastructure. It's very easy to imagine that we integrate AI agents into our cyber defenses in a way that is, we find incredibly useful. And then again, they gain enough independence and autonomy that they too act out in ways that may not be existential, but nonetheless wreak havoc on our critical infrastructure. So I think and this isn't meant to be a sleight of hand, I think many of these scenarios are objectively credible. In some ways, they may be more objectively credible than some of the more existential ones.
Yep.
But as it happens, it may also be a appetizer course to the more extreme versions. So I think one of the things we're doing is trying to plan holistically, not just for the most extreme scenarios, but for the myriad other ones in which AI agents become instrumented in our economy and our security apparatus, and what they do when they gain independence and autonomy is a serious open question. Did that make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, Joel. In fact, I mean, I've spoken with a few of your colleagues, and I commend this effort of thinking through those early stage scenarios because I will be rather frank with you. I do not believe that the political singularity, which is to say when, let's say, 5% of the everyman, like a guy in a small town, like a place where I'm from, it's like a 5,000 person town in Rhode Island. They don't think a lot about AGI down there, Joel. But in order for the political singularity to occur where folks in public sector or just in private life, maybe 1 in 20 of them are pretty much firmly of the belief that this creation of something more powerful than us is categorically the most important thing. I don't actually think we cross that threshold until some degree of disaster. And the hope is, of course, that it would not be existential because, of course, then, Joel, there'd be nothing for us to do. So the hope that they would be relatively minor at some factory somewhere in some cyber context, hopefully not too outlandishly detrimental, to the point where we can have a Chernobyl-ish effect and kind of look at it and say, by golly, we've got to do something about this. So I think preparing for those is crucial. But one of my worries here is that there are multiple categories of AI disaster, in my opinion. One is the category from which we do not return. I need not extrapolate. Number two would be a uniting disaster, which may be what you're articulating. Some factory in the US starts going rogue. The AI has developed objectives that are different than what they were granted, like the ability to extend the volition of these systems to do things and then to research and decide what to do next turns into a cycle that gets scary. And what could happen in a uniting disaster is that when the dust settles, the great powers, that is to say US and China, look at the problem, then look at each other and say, how are we going to handle this? I call that a uniting disaster. Here's another scenario. Same factory happens, but somebody suspects China put malicious code in the AI that made it spin up. And now, when the dust settles, the great powers look each other in the eye and say, how could you have done this? That would be a dividing disaster. Is there anything you think we could do? So this whole hey, if a disaster does happen, and it's a primer for the main course, let's make sure we can handle it and then get our act together in terms of governance and regulation. Aren't there scenarios where this stuff gets accelerated? I'm a little bit fearful of that. I'm not trying to be a pessimist, but what are your thoughts, Joel?
I agree with much of what you said there. Just to amplify or give some additional thoughts. One
Please.
is, in our judgment, it's important to come back to these 5 problems. You don't have to worry about loss of control or misalignment to take AGI seriously. There are 4 other very serious problems.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I think that I can agree with that.
So I know that doesn't need to be said to you, but I think one of the reasons that the conversation on AGI stops is that it goes quickly to some of these more extreme scenarios, even the less extreme of the extreme scenarios. But there's these other reasons to take it very seriously.
Yep.
I think your point that we may need a scenario like that in order to create a window is very important. And we at RAND have an active research effort that's involved with imagining those scenarios across the 5 problems and trying to sort of game them out. To imagine what decision makers would do in those events, what information they would need to make good decisions, and what courses of action should be prepared in advance so that we aren't stuck with bad options. So there's a really important and urgent demand for preparedness. And so we're trying to contribute there. I do think one of the things you're pointing to is really critical, which is attribution. I think attribution is a familiar problem, whether it's in cybersecurity or in biosecurity or nuclear security. But when you get into this world in which it's possible that a human actor or a state actor is employing AGI with enough independence, or maybe it's the AGI itself, it's sort of a different form of attribution. And when we have gamed this out in the past, one of the things we notice is you have a different kind of attribution problem. Is this attack on critical infrastructure a state actor launching a cyber attack, or is it one in which there's just AI run amok? So,
no. I would agree. Look, for me, attribution is kind of the name of the game here. Again, if the great powers, when the dust settles, if it's a disaster we can survive, look at each other and say, how are we going to handle this? That would be the attribution is to the system. It is to an alien. So if you'll recall, Joel, the Greeks stopped fighting each other when the Persian masts were on the horizon. That's when they stopped fighting each other, when the Persian masts were on the horizon. If these are seen as Persian masts, then we will stop fighting each other for a minute. But if it is just seen as, if people don't understand that rogue AI could exist, they say, well, it must be the enemy, then attribution could spill over to humans where they did nothing wrong at all. And just the default, people don't know how to blame a machine. I mean, we all know machines just do what humans want, right? So I'm almost worried that loss of control is a possibility in the mind of the everyman or even folks in the defense world, will be so foreign that they couldn't see this as an alien. It must be another human wielding it in some way, shape, or form. And my hope is that dialogue about loss of control could normalize it and make sure that if such an event did occur, people would have a mental slot to say, oh, that's the AI doing its own thing that everybody talks about. This is my only hope. It's not necessarily optimism, but I don't know if you share that sentiment, Joel, or you have anything else to add there.
I don't have anything else to add, but I completely resonate with the idea. And
yeah,
we have an active line of research here that is trying to imagine these objectively plausible scenarios that could occur in the very near term that may be both crises in their own right, but also signposts that the future is here. And there may be a window of opportunity to take on ambitious policy proposals or enact strategies that prior to that point seemed infeasible.
Yes, it's certainly not feasible when no one cares. And I would say we are still in the place of no one cares. Unfortunately, we will probably have to be jarred out of that by literally losing a few teeth. I wish we didn't need that, but I think probably something will have to strike us. That said, we talk about kind of the biggest risks we want to avoid. I want to talk about kind of like scenarios that would be really the things in the near term that feel like the biggest failure patterns we want to avoid. Of course, we're going to end our conversation today about what you hope we could do in terms of regulation that could kind of set us up. I think your primer scenario work is extremely important. I'm excited to see what you folks produce there. But in terms of like the things that maybe keep you up at night or that you think or your combined teams kind of think are biggest near-term risks, things I've heard on the show, and you may have some different ones to throw into the mix. Certainly there's loss of control. We're in an arms race dynamic to build. We clearly don't know how to control these things. You know it and I know it, right? Anthropic, Altman, everybody will be like, I got no idea, right? Elon Musk will say, it's conjuring the demon, it's going to kill us all. And then he'll race as fast as he can to build it, because the incentives are someone's going to build it anyway. It's a state of nature. So everybody's rushing. We have no ability to be careful. Rogue AI comes about, bad things happen. We want to avoid that. We also want to avoid real conflict between the U.S. and China, be it kinetic, AGI, etc. That could be they build an AGI, we build an AGI, and whether we like it or not, that stuff starts doing stuff, and there's a battle going on. But it also could be we know they're on the cusp of birthing the machine god, and so there's some preemptive strikes. And of course, they have nukes, and we have nukes, and there's that kind of stuff. So there's U.S.-China stuff, there's loss of control stuff, there's maybe the non-state actor getting a hold of something wacky and being able to use bioweapons or whatever and hurting people. Those are three like jeepers. This feels like how this goes wrong. Are there others that you're more concerned about, or are those the three main ones? What are your thoughts here, like failure patterns?
One of the issues that I think is very important that we would probably all acknowledge but tends to be sidelined is the coincident trends in robotics. Most of the attention, to the extent that there's an interest in AGI, most of it is on the frontier model side, naturally. But there are truly impressive developments in the robotic space, particularly in humanoid robots, but other forms. And we could be in a world in not too distant futures where the number of robots in factories and in homes and in elsewhere in society and the economy well outnumber humans, or at least law enforcement or some segment of society. And they're all sort of one software update away from being embodied intelligence of some capability. That seems to me utterly compatible with the technology trends in both AI and in robotics.
100%.
So there are a class of scenarios that are at the convergence of AGI and robotics that I think are worth paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, you're bringing up a great point because, well, this fits into all three of those kinds of risks that were just laid on the table of like the failure patterns where people say, well, look, buddy, what's my chat interface going to do? Oh, it's like, oh, it'll read to me something dangerous to do. Oh, yeah, some people will concede, sure, maybe it'll help a bad guy concoct a bioweapon in his own lab. But it's like, you got to have a lab that can build that stuff. Like, I don't know, it's just some stupid chat interface. But they're kind of leaving off the fact that like, well, Wikipedia's already gotten sucked in, right? YouTube's already gotten sucked in. There's only so much. The other data, the real progress from AGI developing its powers is by touching reality. When there are trillions of nanobots and when there are millions of hominid robots and there are, other millions of industrial robots and robots doing life sciences experiments and machines flying in the air, helicopter or drone stuff, whatever, that's all hooked up to central AI systems. And these things have senses, like you and I have 5 senses. I mean, these things could have 50 or however many we could conceive of, different kinds of tactile, different kinds of vision, whether it be whatever, infrared, who cares? Other things that are more advanced than that. All of that data feeding into central systems builds a much more powerful way of understanding the physical world than simply reading about it in 17,000 Wikipedia articles. And so this feels like an accelerator to all 3 of those risks as far as I can tell. And it's also something people leave off the table when they say, I don't know, man, it's a chat interface. What's it going to do? They're not extrapolating it to be part of a connected, volitional system in the world doing everything from plumbing to roofing to, assembling automobiles.
I think this is an unexplored control surface, maybe not underexplored control surface. I think there's a lot of attention in how we govern the fundamentals of frontier models, whether it be governing compute or governing data, etc. But governing the tools that frontier AI has access to, whether it be robotic embodiments or other things, seems like an important control surface for managing our transition to these futures.
Yeah. So putting all this on the table, I mean, it's a heck of a lot for people to drink in. Again, this audience, fortunately, it's not their first rodeo, but you're crisply articulating kind of some of the things worth considering. And I do think actually your focus on robotics there is great because it is often left out of the conversation and so diminishes the extrapolation of what we're doing. One of the most common refrains I see against AGI even being possible and conceivable is people saying, look, LLMs are not going to get us to AGI. And it's sort of like, to me, absolutely wonky that would be the same as saying, and so AGI will never happen. Like LLMs didn't exist until a couple of years ago. Are we done with breakthroughs? Are there to be no more? How ridiculous. Have you seen how much money is going into this? Do you have any idea how many data centers are about to be built? Get out of here. So I think it's just absolutely absurd, and I despise that argument against AGI, and I think robotics only adds fuel to the credence fire of the fact that we're going in a direction here. Lots of risk floating around and some openings for coordination, which you outlined, which I think was very, very good. A nice balanced introduction to these things. There is no recipe and there's no, if we do these steps, we're going to be good. And certainly we won't be good forever. We're buying time. But when you look forward, half a decade maybe, I don't know. You don't have a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball. I've never interviewed somebody that has one. But when you look forward and you think, what could going well look like? We've got some race dynamics between the labs and between US and China. We've got potentially a technology we cannot control that will not just be able to control your damn smartphone, but it'll be able to walk into your house. What are scenarios where maybe things would actually be kind of cool. Like prosperity might be lifted a little bit. We wouldn't have a lot of risk of war, day-to-day life. This could be okay. Where does your mind go when I ask that?
So we have 2 main lines of effort in our research right now. One is this plans line of effort that I referred to before. And the plans line of effort begins with the premise that the pace of progress is stunning and the capacity for government in general to respond in an anticipatory way is quite limited. And I view that as a property of government in general in this environment, this technology environment, and with this technology, not as a comment on any current politics. The pace of progress is stunning and it's happening outside of government, outside of its control. So in that world, as we've discussed, our strategy for preparing for and living in these AGI futures will come in response to events. Yeah. And so we should be prepared to respond to those events. And as I've alluded to before, we have a large line of effort trying to develop these objectively plausible scenarios that we are running through simulations to try to imagine what policymakers would want to do in a crisis like that and help think through what information they would need in advance and what courses of action they should be available. But the second line of effort is one a little bit more traditional for RAND in the sense that it's focused on strategy. And to the question that I'm responding to here, it's trying to imagine what these different futures look like. What are the ones we want to avoid? Turns out those are easier to imagine.
Yeah.
And what are the ones we want to pursue? And how might those futures that we want to pursue, might they look differently to different actors on the world stage, whether that's the United States, China, or others? And then designing strategies that attempt to pursue the ones you want and avoid the ones you don't. And I have to admit to you that it can be very difficult to imagine some of these futures without sounding very, I don't know, naive.
Yeah. Yeah. Both tracks seem very rational to me. One of them is, hey, we want to flesh out the real risks and challenges that face us, and we want to be able to flesh out what could trigger their increased relevance, and then bring that information to bear to the powers that be to be able to respond when the time occurs. Sounds completely rational. Also, we do want to think about what some of these futures could look like. I think both of those seem reasonable. It feels actually somewhat reasonable that both paths could be pursued. I think it's cool that you're doing both. I would totally agree with you that looking at some of the positive futures seems a little bit stark. And there's 0 point in this interview where I'm asking you to agree with me, by the way. So I'm going to lay out what dawns on me, and you can say, cool, or like, I think about it differently, whatever. But if I'm frank with you, I look at a situation where the international state of affairs does put a pretty hefty pressure on arms racing to some kind of a general intelligence that could open up new magazines of power in terms of physics or biology or some other science that we have not yet named. And Lord knows what all of that would do. We even have arms racing between the labs themselves. I mean, Musk himself knows this stuff will, probably end us all. But I mean, he's still racing hard. I mean, Dario knows the same, still racing hard. Because what's their alternative? You're going to get eaten by somebody else's machine god if it's not by your own. So you might as well race, right? So this is the dynamic we find ourselves in. Nobody knows what the hell's going on. That all looks pretty tough for me. Also, like the idea of eternally saddling and sort of wielding as if it be the horse or as if it be, inert electricity, a embodied agent that could conceive of and act on goals that are beyond our own conception, also seems like it may be not super plausible. And I don't blame the people who ask themselves, well, if this is the state of affairs, if the waves of creative destruction will lap up on the shores this hard and this fast for the span of time ahead of us, we may also need to think pretty squarely about what ought to carry on beyond us. If sort of bio-life and civilization as it stands right now is not really going to kind of hold up, could the project of life continue even if it doesn't have opposable thumbs, et cetera? Like there are people who go there because they look at all these factors and they say, yeah, I just don't really think like we're going to have self-driving cars and like we're all going to go water skiing on the weekends like in 30 years. Like, I just don't think it's going to happen. I'm actually just not sure we're going to have kind of any of what we have right now. I don't blame people that go all the way there because I see it as stark like you do. It's like, yeah, positive futures seem naive. God, Joel, I wish I didn't agree, but I do.
Yeah. Well, let me sharpen that a little bit. I don't know that. First off, this is a helpful conversation. I think we have to have more of these conversations. So I admire your podcast and the fact that you get to have these kinds of conversations. So thank you. Second, I think that one of the challenges, one of the ways that it feels naive is I think less because the particular vision is naive, but almost any vision sort of comes with it some sort of like halt condition. Like we imagine things have stopped for a period.
Yes.
And I know no one actually means that, but like the pace of change embedded in these scenarios is so stunning and rapid that it'll be continually be dynamic. So I guess this may be too meta to be useful, but one fairly somewhat positive vision is that we simply preserve decision space for the United States, for humanity, for all of us as we go. So we don't lock ourselves into some future that we would rather not do. So it's a little bit meta, but again, it comes back to this logic of buying time. To think that we're going to imagine our way through this is a little bit difficult, but
Yeah, I think it's very plausible to say that let's leave open the option for kind of a wide berth of choices here and options ahead of us. And I think some of this, to your point, we have to cross the bridge when it comes to it. We need to buy time, see what emerges, deal with it. And seems, again, the pace of change is going to be so rapid. How exactly do we come out the back of this? Going to be a tough call, but I think that's a measured stance in terms of where we're at. And speaking of that, in terms of kind of where we want to go, part of this has to do with how we govern this stuff. So we'll kind of end speaking a little bit about what you hope the regulator ecosystem and the innovator ecosystem do to maybe keep those lines of choice open and maybe keep some of the risks a little lower than they would be otherwise, just based on kind of your initial thinking through of some of these things. So if we think about the governance of this stuff, I mean, in your folks' report, obviously putting AGI on the map as something categorically different than AI, clearly in the mix. Thinking about how to make sure this stuff doesn't get in the hands of non-state actors, clearly in the mix. But maybe a bit more concretely from your standpoint, we could talk about maybe just what you've published or some of your other ideas, whatever you're comfortable with. Regulators, man, what do you hope they take away from this? And what do you feel like they should be doing a bit more of than maybe they're doing now? Or a little bit less of?
So a few thoughts on this. First is, I suppose somebody somewhere has a precise definition of regulators. I'm going to step out and just talk about policymakers in general.
Great. That sounds good.
A few things that feel to me like robust, plausibly no regret things that the United States government should be doing. The first is, which should be taken for granted but can't be, is just much greater situational awareness, the global AI ecosystem. Where are the models? Where's the compute? What are the progress? What are the frontier models capable of? And knowing all these facts well before we need them. So we don't want to enter a world in which one of these crises that you and I have imagined in this conversation without those sort of basic facts at hand. So number one is you need much deeper situational awareness of the global AI, and I would add to that robotics ecosystem. The second thing is, I think that we need to develop a more dynamic and scalable relationship between the U.S. government and the frontier labs and hyperscalers. I don't think that we're in a moment where any one particular relationship makes a lot of sense. But there needs to be a mechanism by which we can evolve that relationship initially, maybe just for situational awareness and early access to models and maybe some security and awareness of what kind of bottlenecks they're facing. But over time, the relationship between the U.S. government and the frontier labs could change, and we'd want to have in place a mechanism to scale it quickly or dynamically anyway. We want to be able to prevent surprise, not just in the technology, but it's in its use. So I think a lot of the attention goes to model evaluations, but we also just need to put the model in the hands of people that would want to use it for science, for healthcare, for the military, for cyber, so that they're not aware just of what particular benchmark it's being crossed, but they have a much more tactical feeling for how it could be used. Third is, I think we need to promote its adoption, which is related in the U.S. government. That's related to the kind of experimentation I was just referring to, but it's hard to imagine us transitioning to these futures without AI being part of the solution. So in small ways and in big ways, it seems like AI needs to get integrated into our government. And then lastly, we just need to be prepared for a much broader set of scenarios. And so there's it feels a little bit self-interested, I recognize, as a RAND analyst, but there just needs to be more of a contingency planning function in this space that policymakers can use to, within government, be prepared. I think that we have grown accustomed to thinking in terms of what the U.S. government could do with such a powerful technology, or must do to govern, regulate, strategize, use AI. But it should go without saying that the business community and civil society has an enormous role. And I think that's more than a throwaway. I think that there's unexplored territory in how we can align incentives and think about the role of, again, the business community and civil society in helping us capitalize on the tremendous opportunities of AGI that may present, but also manage these risks and make our society more resilient, our society and our economy more resilient. So I think one of the, we often talk about public-private partnerships. And
Yes.
we imagine that as a relationship between the U.S. government and frontier labs, but there's a much higher level of public-private partnership in which we imagine a relationship, different kind of relationship between the U.S. government and the business community and civil society. And I think we're at the early days of imagining what that looks like.
Okay, cool. So we got 5 or so points to kind of poke into. Let me just dive in with a few of these. One of them was kind of the relationship between these labs and, the government. And it seems self-evident to me that if you can birth something more powerful than, at some point than the species itself, probably you're not just going to be able to do that willy-nilly in the private sector. It's always seemed self-evident that at some point, now probably, I hate to tell you, Joel, I think we might need one of those doggone disasters you talked about before these things start getting catalyzed. But some people are putting their feelers out. At some point, there is a commandeering of sorts, of sort of like the materials that could conjure the thing that ends the world, or conjure the thing that is of the greatest power and leverage conceivable. It seems self-evident. Having conversations with, we had Mike Brown on, who used to run the DIU. So you talked about, innovation, making its way into the government. I mean, Mike's whole thing was sort of trying to very hard battle. When I say uphill, I mean like probably at like this kind of an 80-degree angle, uphill battle of making it easier for the DoD to adopt AI. Bless Mike for giving it a shot, and I think he probably did move the needle in some regards. Really hard work. But I sort of asked, like, don't you think it's going to be necessary at some point for there to kind of be like a pretty robust marriage between the government and all of the players that are building this most important thing, and that this won't just be like a for-profit shebang anymore? And he was like, I don't really think so. I think the private. Now, he's not in the DoD anymore, so he could speak as a free man here. But he still really didn't see it. And I don't see a lot of people seeing it. Why do you see that tighter, more dynamic knitting relationship as essential? I presume what you're talking about is some kind of an extension of the central powers these things become, where they're not really just making calls on their own anymore. They're sort of reporting into some kind of a bigger central body. Maybe talk a little bit about rough sketch what you guys have talked about in terms of possible ideas, and then what your strongest arguments are for, how that might happen.
I think when you imagine the potential relationship between the U.S. government and frontier labs, you should begin by thinking through what our objectives are. And there are multiple objectives one could have. One is, again, as I've mentioned, simply maintaining situational awareness of where the frontier is. That involves one type of relationship. Another type of objective of a relationship is being able to secure the frontier. Because of these racing dynamics, these frontier labs are at risk intellectual property theft, among other things. They potentially are vulnerable to various modes of cyber and other forms of attack. And so there's a relationship that is rooted in the prospect of the U.S. government securing the frontier. There's another objective, which is to worry much more about safety of the models, becoming aware, not just aware, but protecting the models from misuse by non-state actors or others, or state actors who want to use an otherwise very productive capability to cause harm. There's other relationship that's involved with the government may have in accelerating the frontier's progress. And that would require a relationship that would involve us knowing what are the limiting factors that constrain the frontier lab's progress so that the U.S. government can help to alleviate them. And the key point here is I think that the objectives one may have could change over time. And to imagine sort of one relationship to rule them all probably is unwise. It's also unwise to imagine that you're going to sort of put in place the relationship you need in the moment you need it.
Yeah, no way. I mean, clearly we need that forecasting, pre-thinking, et cetera.
So I think this is what calls for like a scalable and dynamic relationship between the U.S. government and the labs. It's one that can adjust, that has some basis today, but also can evolve over time.
I completely agree. I mean, it seems to me like the dynamic probably gets closer and closer. In other words, I don't see a threshold where it's like, well, now that AGI is super powerful, let's pay a little bit less attention to exactly what all the big labs are doing, right? I mean, it seems like over time they're probably going to get much more snug. I don't probably see backwards movement from kind of levels of integratedness and control and coordination through the government for the technology that could be vastly more powerful than humanity. I don't know if you would agree with that statement, but I kind of see this dynamic having kind of a tide that is going in a certain direction, even if its forms take different strides, shapes, points of emphasis. Okay, tough to say.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. Yeah, the relationship between the labs and the government is such a politically fraught question right now. Probably hard. I would rather not touch it. I don't know if I've done a good job actually, but I'm trying to. I mean, there are good reasons, sort of not for the show, but there are good reasons, and some of my colleagues, have good reasons to believe that of specific forms of collaboration right now. They may not be politically viable.
At the time being.
So,
yep. So okay. So that makes sense. I mean, I think there could be some different ways we see this going. Kind of like a snugging up over time as the technology gets stronger and stronger. But what you're saying is it's not like, oh, well, the way it works is, on one day, the government would tell the labs what to do. It's like, well, they could start to get closer around aligning on safety. They could start to get closer around aligning about capabilities. There's a lot of ways that relationships could begin based on the dynamic system that emerges. But your preference here is that we at least think through what those dynamics could look like and when they could come about as this technology gets more and more serious and we kind of roll forward. And that sort of leads into the point that you put on the table, which is that, as a biased RAND fella, we should do more forethought on this. I will say I'm not a RAND fella, and I happen to think it's incredibly important. So I don't actually, fortunately, I don't think this is a place where you're speaking too much just from having a dog in the fight. I think it's self-evident we need to be thinking much more thoroughly about this technology that could be so transformative. When it comes to leveling up that thinking and getting more people to kind of extend what possible futures could look like and really give it more thought now so that when certain things happen, we'll be in a better position. Like, what seems most important to move us in that direction? I mean, you brought up the scenario planning you guys are doing, which might start to spark some ideas. Do you think efforts along those lines need to happen, within the Department of Energy, within the intelligence world, and within should more of those kind of exercises be brought to those different departments? Should they do this by talent, maybe hiring people that have backgrounds in this space? Like making the forethought happen early. I'm completely with you. I think it's mandatory. We're dealing with something unprecedented. Gosh, what are some of the things that policymakers could be doing to hope to knit in some of that knowledge ahead of time?
I mean, are you asking, in essence, Dan, how do we get more people that are AGI pilled?
More or less. More or less, yes. At least pilled along the lines of, okay, it's technically plausible, even if uncertain. Here's what could occur and some things that we might do to respond to it. So maybe not people that say, oh my God, I think about AGI every day when I wake up in the morning. Although, I actually think that probably would be a good thing. But maybe they're not there, but they're at least at the level of, okay, there could be some leaps and bounds that are going to make us think differently. How could we think differently? Getting people at least to that threshold of considering new futures as a useful exercise, not as a science fiction exercise.
One of my colleagues said something to me that I think is relevant here. I won't quote them, but they said, I'll take AI seriously when it solves a real human problem, by which I took to mean, it doesn't just make better suggestions for my Netflix.
Yeah. Yes.
Cures cancer. It solves addiction problems. It, materially extends human life, helps resolve homelessness. whatever the myriad, we have plenty of real human problems. I think most of our conversation has been focused on the risks, but
Yeah.
one of the ways we might start to take this much more seriously is we see it, again, solve real human problems.
Yeah. I mean, I like the sentiment, and there's definitely a lot of warm and fuzzies about people not being homeless. I would say like supply chain is a problem. And, writing software to adapt to new needs in sort of very real time is a real problem. Accessing the totality of the knowledge of humanity in real time, not just through a Google search to read something, but through, like hyper personalized recommendations for either a banana bread recipe or a way to help your teenager who's starting to hang out with the wrong crowd or whatever. Those all feel pretty real. But I guess what you're saying is, clearly there's some very big breakthrough stuff that maybe will help this stuff get on the radar. Are you saying that it might make sense for us to foster a conversation about those big and positive breakthroughs to get people to think about this more? In other words, not just the risks, but also the upside?
I think it's a great question you raised. You raised the question, there's all these options that many of them feel like no regret options that the U.S. government should embark upon. What would it take for those options to be taken more seriously? And we'd like a better option than a crisis, a disaster.
Yeah. So would I.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the essence of your question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wish I had a good answer to that question. I mean, we are trying to run, crisis exercises which simulate them. So that seems like an easy step.
I think there's a lot of folks with a little bit of a brick wall about how do we really get people to take this more seriously. I actually think there is a lot of credence to, and I was excited when I spoke with one of your colleagues around, hey, maybe we can look at some of the things that are likely to happen in the near term so that when they happen, we can really unravel the ramifications for innovation and regulation when that occurs. And so that might be one of the low-hanging fruits to make this happen. I mean, you or I may not be missing something obvious. We may actually be touching on the thing, which is like, yeah, mostly people are going to have to feel this to care, and we should at least think about the things they're most likely to feel so that we can catalyze that as an opportunity to buy some time, which is not, that's not an insignificant insight, honestly. So I don't mind that as the takeaway, if that's our main takeaway here.
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, I think the takeaway for the audience here is like, all things considered, nobody's got all the answers on this. Like, there's going to be a lot of bridges we have to come to. Almost everybody we're chatting with is kind of stumped on exactly what the right paths are. But I think there is some consensus on we should be talking about this more. And Joel, if we did nothing else today, we talked about this more here today, and hopefully got some good ideas out to some minds that are hungry for them, and some of the folks that actually are already kind of thinking a little bit through these futures, maybe have a little bit more clarity on some of the challenges ahead and where they might want to put their attention. So I know that's all we have for time, but Joel, it's been a real pleasure. I'm glad we got to connect today.
Very good. I appreciate the opportunity. It was really it couldn't be a more important topic, and I appreciate the space you're creating for me, but many others to discuss it. So thank you, Dan.
So that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Big thank you to Joel for being able to be with us. He is normally very much in research mode. He's not out there in the media all the time, but he was kind enough to join us, and I appreciate that. I've met a lot of very smart RAND people as that company is all of a sudden sort of woken up to AGI. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to you for listening all the way through the end of this episode. I've got a couple things to say, 3 separate things to say to the end of this episode, just kind of building on what Joel had said, things that come to mind for me. So I'm going to look at my notes here. First off, it's interesting. Some of what Joel mentioned, some of the, if we don't know when it'll happen, but, we should really take seriously that it could happen. And hey, if it was created, it wouldn't be an app on your phone. It would be like a new species. Some of these things are like, IEET or Miri forums, 12 years ago kind of things, right? Where now it's taking that long for this stuff to reach, the people that can speak to the public sector, because the public sector still has no clue what's going on here. But there were plenty of things that Joel said that were not obvious. So it's not like RAND is simply parroting, the things everybody saw coming. It's safe to say they weren't caring about it when the caring first started. But I think a lot was added here in terms of the international tension and coordination opportunity, kind of the global geopolitics component. I think Joel added a lot there in terms of how to think about how tensions would arise. I think the older sets of thoughts around this were sort of like, create AGI and it'll overrun people and sort of kill them and whatever, or like one country's going to want to race ahead of the other. I don't think there was as much clarity on sort of maybe how some of those tensions will manifest as Joel brought up. So it's cool to see some of the very old and obvious things restated by, a fellow who, wears a blazer and talks to people in the public sector. And now the public sector hopefully will listen because it's coming through that medium, not from these wacky forums from a dozen years ago. But also that a lot of new nuance, I think, is being added. I think it's great to have RAND in the mix. And Joel's full report, I'll make sure is linked in the show notes. You guys should check that out. Second, Joel mentions some of the opportunities to coordinate, which I think were pretty cool. There's two that I jotted down that I just want to highlight. One of them is sort of a shared potential risk of the loss of control. And another is kind of the instability along the path to these futures. Even if there's benefits, there's a lot of instability with like job loss and, other sorts of, defense tensions, war tensions around this technology that could sort of forge new excuses to have new kinds of coordination, even if our ways of governing are actually very, very different between the US and China. And I thought that was great to highlight. Previously, and some of you have seen this video solo article on AGI disasters. So I sort of categorize, and for those of you watching the video, I'll put the image up on screen of the types of AGI disasters. I've long been of the perspective that essentially, if some kind of an AI disaster occurs where humanity is still alive, of course, there's some disasters where we're all gone. But if a disaster occurs where some of us are still alive and nation states are still functioning, if they point at each other and say, how could you do this? In other words, if the blame, rightly or wrongly, doesn't matter, if the blame is perceived to be the international rival, this will accelerate arms race and risk. If when they look at each other, they then look back at the damage and they say, how are we going to deal with this together, right? Then it will decrease arms race tensions. So that I call that sort of a uniting disaster versus a dividing disaster. Joel talks about loss of control. I think priming the US and China leadership that, hey, if there's loss of control, it doesn't always mean it's the enemy. It could be this tech is a new species and we need to coordinate around it. Joel is highlighting something I very much agree with there. And again, I'd highly recommend reading through his full report. And lastly, he brought up a point that I think is really interesting. I've never heard anybody word it this way. He said, I said, man, how do you make it click that this is a new species and not just an app on someone's phone? In the public sector where people are so far behind, or, even for RAND, this is all kind of new for them to think about, right? You go back 5 years, they weren't publishing blog posts about this. There was no geopolitics of AGI there. And he said, everyone has their own journey and they have to sit with it for a while. And I thought that was really interesting because, there is no, silver bullet here. I think there's probably ways of communicating it, but I think ultimately my interpretation of that, and the way that I think about this transformation generally of people's perception is that, it's not you give them a couple facts and then they chew on it and they say, oh, I agree. I think it works this way. I think that people have to understand the basics and then mentally think through all the future scenarios. Like, oh, what's it going to look like in education? What would this mean for international competition? What would it mean if it improved even this much per year, right? Even if acceleration slowed down, which it's not. But if it did, even then, God, what would this look like in 5 years? They have to look at all the dimensions of their lives and all the ways this could go and kind of come to the conclusion that in a huge preponderance of them, maybe the vast majority of them, we're going to be running into a whole new species. So it's not that people have to chew on it and say, oh, I get it. Instead, their neurons have to shoot into futures fire into all kinds of futures, because everybody sort of secretly wants futures that are very similar to what they experience today. Things that are soothing, right? I'm still going to go to my lake house. I'm still going to go water skiing. My kids are going to go to school, then they're going to play baseball, right? These things help me go to sleep at night. They soothe me as a child would need to be soothed. People mostly want that because thinking of divergent change too much is just a lot of cognitive dissonance. But when they have enough facts to connect the dots, and in all the futures they shoot forward with, they say, wow, we're probably really going to have to deal with this. Then the hook sinks. Now you can start a real conversation. So I think your own journey, you have to sit with it. My hypothesis is that's actually the sub-process going on. I don't know if that's true for Joel, and I don't know if it's true for you, but that's my conception. It was certainly my experience, and I think it has been of some others as well. Share in the show notes what your thoughts are on that. I'm interested. If you're watching this, presumably you care about these things. Did it come to your mind in that way? Who knows? Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I had a lot of fun talking to Joel. Again, he's not like on the interview circuit. That's not his thing. But I read his work. I knew it'd make sense to talk to him, and I am really glad we did. So thanks so much for tuning in. I look forward to catching you on the next one here on The Trajectory.